Poe, like many others in this scene, was not from Baltimore. Poe was born up in Boston, and as a young man, very interested in the power of writing, he wrote poetry, short stories, literary criticism, and when Poe was 20, um, he already knew John Neal's work. John Neal at that point, more well-known writer than Poe was, and John Neal like complimented Poe and encouraged him. Early American writing was fixated on imitating British writing, and John Neal was an early part of this movement to try to break American writing away from British writing. That American writing should be distinctive because America was distinctive. And Neal saw that quality in Poe's writing. And Poe later said that this meant a lot to him. It encouraged him at a time when not everybody liked Poe's writing. Poe won an award for his writing in Baltimore in 1833. Lived in Baltimore for a little bit. Wrote for the Baltimore Sunday Visitor, which you see here. But then he got a better job down in Richmond at the Southern Literary Messenger, which you see here. But Poe was a complicated guy who definitely really liked to drink. And his drinking got him fired from the Southern Literary Messenger. He moved back to Baltimore in the 1830s and got a license to marry his 13-year-old cousin when Poe was now significantly older. Not sure what year this was, but they are not both in their teens. And but got permission, married his 13-year-old cousin, eventually got rehired back at the Southern Literary Messenger, and spent the 1830s and 40s kind of bouncing around between Philadelphia, New York City, Richmond, Baltimore, and his most famous writing, The Raven, was published in 1845. If you've never read The Raven, it's an incredibly fun little story. Poe died in Baltimore in 1849. The circumstances of his death in Baltimore in 1849 we will discuss later in the next lecture. Remember I promised you that we were going to come back to Sarah Miriam Peele? High five. We're doing it. Sarah Miriam Peele was Charles Willson Peele's niece. Rembrandt Peale, the guy who opened the Peale Museum in Baltimore, was her cousin. She was from Philadelphia, where, Charles Willson Peele's her uncle, and she came down from Philadelphia at the age of 18 to visit her cousin Rembrandt in Baltimore. And Rembrandt encouraged her painting. She had not gotten this kind of encouragement from any accomplished male artist before. And she also liked Baltimore. Baltimore had a kind of bohemian, it, I mean, hippie is from a different era, but these sort of artists and writers who, you know, move according to their own rules. She painted her self-portrait in Baltimore in 1818 at the age of 18. And she went back home to Philadelphia, but talked to her parents and then moved back to Baltimore at age 20, and spent some more time with Rembrandt, did more painting, and then moved to Baltimore full time in, I think, 1822. She set up her own studio in Baltimore. There were, at this point, no working female portrait artists anywhere in the United States except Sarah Miriam Peale in Baltimore. She, met these artists and writers who were in Baltimore, and she then painted this portrait of John Neal in 1823. Neal liked it. Um, Other writers and Baltimoreans came to her for their portraits. She also did, still lifes, like you see. These are her work as well. Um, she painted in Baltimore with a successful studio until 1847. That was like 25 years. It's incredible. I mean, it's incredible for any time. It's incredible for the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. In 1847, she got sick, and when you got sick in the 1800s, people often recommended a different climate. Um, they didn't understand what got people sick. They're still operating according to the four humors. So she moved out west, moved to St. Louis. She died a few years later. Before we leave this post-war Baltimore bit, the Maryland Historical Society was established in 1844. Established by a group who realized that the colonial records from Maryland's colonial history were molding in an Annapolis basement. And so this Baltimore group got together, tried to rescue those records and preserve them for historians of the future. They got Robert Carey Long Jr. to design a building to house the Maryland Historical Society. That became the Athenaeum, which opened in 1848. The Maryland Historical Society, in so many ways, has enabled me to teach this class. They've preserved so much, and now, of course, they have so much of it digitized, so it can be accessed right from my office on the computer. It's amazing. All right, we're shifting from post-war Baltimore, although may have a bit more on it later on, to politics. And the key term here, the way I've tried to structure things is Maryland politics, national politics. And of course, zip back to the outline, this is focused on Maryland politics, national politics in this specific time frame. As always, remember I have the little key term indicators up in the left-hand corner. So let's start with some national politics. The War of 1812 came to an end, and the Federalist Party was essentially destroyed. The I don't know if we fleshed this out much in the last lecture, but the Federalist Party had been against the war with Britain, the War of 1812, and at the end of that war, the war became very popular with Americans because of Andrew Jackson's victory down in New Orleans. So the Federalists looked unpatriotic, un-American, and their party was rapidly disintegrating. In 1816, Congress passed a law creating a national tariff. The tariff, I don't know if you've ever heard about tariffs from the news or anything like that, but a tariff is a tax on imports. And the idea of passing a tariff in 1816 was to make imported manufactured goods more expensive for the American consumer. Wait, what? Why do we want to make things more expensive? Because if those imported foreign goods are more expensive, then that might make it feasible for someone in America to start making that thing here instead. The idea of the tariff was to stimulate American manufacturing, to get Americans to make stuff. Because if you start a company and start making, I don't know, wood stoves, your wood stoves aren't going to have a tariff placed on them when you try to sell them in the United States. All those wood stoves made in Britain are going to have to pay a tariff. The northern part of the country, really in some ways, from Baltimore stretching upwards, was the part of the country where manufacturing was growing quickly. So those manufacturing parts of the country were happy with the tariff. The southern parts of the country, where there wasn't much manufacturing, didn't like the tariff. They generally felt like the tariff was set up to favor the northern states and not do anything for the southern states. In the same year, 1816, Congress renewed the National Bank. This National Bank was originally Alexander Hamilton's idea back in the early Republic, and the National Bank tried to bring some stability to America's banking situation. The National Bank was unpopular. Both these things were unpopular with people who wanted the federal government to be weak, which was a lot of people in this period, who thought that the federal government should stay weak and the states should have most of the power. As part of that sentiment, that states should have more power than the federal government, Maryland would soon take a move against that new national bank. But first, let's check in with national politics, where in 1816, in the electoral map, you can see what I mean about the Federalist Party dying out. The Federalists got 16% of the electoral vote. That is technically not good. Yeah, so James Monroe becomes your new president, your fifth American president in 1816. James Monroe was another slave-holding Virginian. So far, 4 of the first 5 presidents had been slave-holding Virginians. As James Monroe came into office in 1817, the Republicans, Democratic Republicans as they're sometimes rendered, also controlled both the House and the Senate in the U.S. Congress. This was, as some called it, the beginning of the era of good feelings. This idea came from a newspaper editorial, which you see over here, celebrating the fact that we were entering an age without political parties. Right? Because if the Federalist Party dies out, then we just have one party. And if we have one party, then in a way, we might have no parties. This is where people felt like the future might be heading. It was in this moment, 1817, that the Maryland General Assembly passed a law to tax the national bank. The national bank created by the federal government. Maryland's law claimed that any bank operating in the state of Maryland that was, according to the law, opened without the authority of the state had to pay a tax on any paper notes that they issued or pay an annual fee to the state of Maryland, which was $15,000. Maryland was saying to the federal government, yeah, we're going to tax the federal government's bank that exists in our state. This dispute, whether or not a state could do this to a federal institution, would result in one of the first highly significant U.S. Supreme Court cases. And that is where we'll continue next. But before we leave here, I just wanted a little postscript here to mention that the governor who signed the law so that Maryland could tax the national bank was Charles Ridgely. Old man Charles Ridgely, who was one of the guys who pushed for the Revolution, one of the guys who formed the Sons of Liberty, that Baltimore Iron Works owner. He served his term as governor, retired, and then passed the events that we're talking about here. He died in 1824. And in 1824, in his will, he manumitted all of his slaves. The Revolution was at this point almost 50 years ago. But here's a guy who lived through it and was still feeling affected by it. And he was among the last of that revolutionary generation to die. Like Thomas Jefferson died 2 years later, 1826, and in his will manumitted none of his slaves. Okay, so little side detour there for Charles Ridgely, but next we'll be headed for the Supreme Court case that came out of Maryland's effort to tax the national bank. For that, that's next time.